Yasaburo Hachiya is Japanese, and his wife, Klavdia Novakova, is Russian. They lived in the small village of Progress, deep in Russia's far eastern taiga, for almost 40 years. It's around 6,000 kilometers from the capital Moscow. Another unusual fact is that the two fell in love during a period of very strained relations between the Soviet Union and Japan. Both were prisoners during the Second World War at the same labor camp in Siberia where they met. After being freed, they decided never to separate again. But they had to part in old age. Klavdia still lives in Russia, whereas Yasaburo returned to Japan. But it wasn't on his initiative. His Russian wife begged him to go. Up until this very day, they remain true to each other. Though separated by hundreds of kilometers, they still consider themselves man and wife. Today there is only a fresh local newspaper and no letter, but it will come sooner or later, perhaps even tomorrow. She has already sent a few lines to Japan, and it means that Yasaburo sent a message back on the same day. This is normal for them. They seem to have a plan. Before the village had a telephone link, Klavdia and Yasaburo wrote to each other almost every day.
Our letters traveled for too long. Sometimes they even seemed to get lost. And so he and I decided to number our letters, so we would know that they were not lost. I had possibly 100 letters, a lot.
At a fixed hour each Saturday, the telephone rings in Klavdia's house. For her, the old handset has a special sound that she doesn't confuse with her neighbor's or her old friend's phone across the village. In 11 years, Yasaburo hasn't missed a single Saturday. Klavdia knows his timing and is out and about earlier than usual. She must remember all of the latest village news and convey greetings from everyone he knew or was friendly with.
Dear, Isakovich and Lyubov paid me a visit earlier today.
Have they already arrived?
Yes, they have, and they send you their love.
Okay, good, thanks.
At home in Japan, Yasaburo is a pensioner, the same as he was in Russia. And he almost has the same duties. He goes to collect his pension and returns to clean the house and work for a while in his tiny garden. Several vegetable patches and flower beds fill every inch of this plot, measuring 10 square meters. In Russia, Klavdia always planted a lot of flowers. At the village of Progress, Yasaburo, like every householder, had a large kitchen garden, where he spent a lot of time. But he always found a few minutes for flowers. When he returned to Japan, he started by planting several chrysanthemums and rose bushes.
All these flowers are chrysanthemums. Different. Brands, big, small, white and red. These are yellow.
Yasaburo's story, both happy and sad, started in the small neighborhood of Tottori in southern Japan, only to return here. Yasaburo was born into a large family of a wealthy industrialist. He received a good education and married 25-year-old Hisako. When the Second World War started, his father suddenly went bankrupt, so Yasaburo chose to take his young wife and leave the country, which was at war, for the peaceful Korea, where it was also easier to find food. They had 2 children there. Before Japan's capitulation, Soviet troops went into Korea to fight against the Japanese, alongside Western allies also involved in the conflict. All males of Japanese origin were arrested under suspicion of espionage against the Soviet Union. Like his other compatriots, Yasaburo was sentenced to 10 years forced labor under Article 58, Part 6 of espionage. The Japanese convicts were deported to the Soviet Union's extreme northern areas near Magadan.
Had I committed suicide, they'd have branded me a spy, because a real spy would have killed himself for certain in an impossible situation of this kind. This is why I couldn't bring myself to do it. No matter how hard life is, you must go on living.
It was at the camp that Yasaburo first saw a Russian girl named Klavdia. She fell in love with him at first sight. He was different from the other prisoners.
I somehow liked him very much. He was sitting at a table in the canteen. I saw he wasn't Russian, and he was eating very nicely. Later, we met at the cloakroom. I gave in my ticket and they issued my coat. He held it for me like a gentleman, just like a man. We left together and started talking. That was how we met.
Yasaburo was flattered by the attention he received from that beautiful Russian girl. But he was afraid to confess to who he was and why he'd been exiled to Siberia. He wouldn't accept the spying charges.
What's your nationality, she asked. Chinese? No, I said. Korean? No. From Uzbekistan? Who am I? And I said, Japanese. She was scared. What are you doing here?
Before the Second World War, like thousands of other young people, Klavdia responded to appeals from the Soviet authorities and went to the country's Far East to take part in its development. She got a job as an accountant in a shop, but was falsely accused of embezzling state money. A court sentenced the young woman to 10 years of forced labor. In 1953, after Joseph Stalin's death, the prisoners began to be freed from jails and camps en masse. Klavdia was among them, and when her friends called her to the village of Progress in the Amur region, she agreed to go. As soon as she settled there, she wrote a letter to Yasaburo, who, after his release, unlike many of his compatriots who simply had nowhere to go, went to Klavdia. They started living together and soon got married. Klavdia was a bookkeeper at the village council for many years. After she retired on a pension, she worked as a tea lady at the People's Court. Her life with Yasaburo was harmonious. At parties, Yasaburo was the one who led the singing. And to this very day, he still sings for her.
Give me a song, please. I feel so sad.
To you?
Yes, give me a song.
Yasaburo became the best hairdresser in the village. His reputation spread far and wide. Women from across the area flocked to see him. His old clients remember him to this day.
Он в первом поселке освоил вот химическую завивку, и все модницы старались попасть к нему. И он также обучил других мастеров вот этому искусству. И женщины, в общем, стремились попасть к нему, потому что знали, что он их сделает просто красавицами.
Yasaburo worked 8-hour shifts, one day in the morning, the next day after lunch. There was no real money in it, but he learned how to speak perfect Russian, a language difficult for the Japanese and other nationalities. His teachers were the village women.
I was a ladies' hairdresser. In that job, you have to pay attention. You have to curl their hair. That takes a lot of time. And they grow tired. And so you must amuse them. Sometimes I even told them a joke. And so, step by step, I learned how to speak Russian.
The villagers sported good looks on Yasuboro's photographs as well. After 10 years as a hairdresser, he developed aching legs, and doctors suggested he find a different job. He didn't mind retraining and became a photographer. Nikolai Yeltsov was Yasuboro's workmate for 12 years. He has fond memories to this day. Yasuboro never seemed to lose self-control, even in the most dramatic situations.
He could take apart and assemble any piece of equipment. He sharpened scissors and clippers with his own hands. He could fix cameras and motorbikes. He was just a technology wizard. He wasn't afraid to disassemble and reassemble things.
One day, Nikolai and Yasuboro were invited to a remote military garrison to take officers' ID and family photographs. No sooner did they remove covers from their equipment than it dawned on the military that a foreign-looking man was on their off-limits territory and with a camera.
They put us under arrest and exposed our film. We felt nervous throughout the night and we couldn't sleep. In the morning, they already knew what was what, and they let us go.
That night, Klavdia didn't sleep a wink. At first, she expected her husband to come back, and became frantic when he didn't turn up. She was afraid that Yasuboro had been sent to a camp again. They had lived in the village for 15 years, but some people still believed that Yasuboro was a Japanese spy.
All these people have been in the spotlight. Who is it going to be today? Daily, every 4 hours, Spotlight.
After his release, Yasuboro, not having Soviet citizenship, had to report to the local police station on a weekly basis, and each and every time he would ask them when he would be extradited to Japan. But in 1956, they told him his Japanese passport had been lost, which meant he didn't have the right to leave the Soviet Union, and advised him to ask the authorities for Soviet citizenship.
It is written here that Yasuboro Hachiya acquired citizenship from Japanese nationality in 1956. This is number 1 form for Hachiya Yasuboro because he was issued a passport at this office.
In the early 1960s, ships loaded with former prisoners of war went to Japan from the Soviet Union's far eastern seaports. However, Yasuboro had become a Soviet citizen and couldn't leave.
The last time, 13 people left. Well, I thought I was a member of that batch, but I wasn't on the list and had to stay.
In 1996, an old friend of Klavdia's told her that her brother had organized a Russian-Japanese joint venture. It was then that Klavdia wrote a letter to the businessman in the hope that his Japanese partners might be of help in finding Yasuboro's relatives. The Japanese were interested and said if Yasuboro is really of Japanese stock, let him write something in his native language for us. Yasuboro refused at first. 52 years had passed since he had left his homeland, almost an entire lifetime. But Klavdia managed to convince Yasuburo.
All of a sudden, we received a message saying that his brother was alive. This was a sensation, of course. Sometime later, it turned out his wife was alive, and his daughter too, that no one had given any thought to at all.
Yasuburo's Japanese wife, Hisako, had survived by miracle in Korea. Carrying her small daughter in a knapsack, she managed to reach Japan. Her son died while they were on the move, but her daughter grew up and became established at home. Hisako never married again and waited for Yasuburo. She received a small wage as a nurse, and she had put a little aside for her beloved husband. An entire delegation went to the village of Progress in the Amur region to collect Yasuburo. But he surprised everyone by saying he wasn't going anywhere, nor would he leave Klavdia, with whom he had lived for the last 40 years.
He wouldn't have gone. He wouldn't have gone. He knew his relatives were waiting for him there. But he also knew that Klavdia had given her whole life to him. He thought she would be alone in her old age if he left.
Yasuburo only allowed himself to be convinced after Klavdia promised she would certainly come to Japan to visit him. The whole village was out in force to see Yasuburo off.
And I said to him on parting, "You look around. If you feel any unpleasant attitudes, take off your hat and go to the people and ask them to contribute to how much it might cost to travel to Khabarovsk. I'll go there to meet you and we'll live together till death do us part." Thank God that never happened.
Yasuburo had been away from home for 52 years, more than half a century. His birthplace is southern Japan, where everything was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. This was how Yasuburo felt in the wake of his return.
I didn't have the chance to watch the sea in Russia. When you go to the Amur River in Khabarovsk, it looks like the sea all right, but it's not the real thing. It's real when you see that line, the horizon. It wasn't like that up there.
The unusual story of Klavdia Novikova and Yasuburo Hasiya caused a stir in Japan. The news of a compatriot's homecoming spread like wildfire and generated a spate of newspaper articles and TV reports on how a Russian woman had behaved in the case of her Japanese husband. A local writer, Yasuka Murao, decided to write a novel describing the touching relationship between a Russian girl and a Japanese prisoner of war.
I went to Russia on purpose in order to collect material for my book. I had long talks with Klavdia and I realized that we in Japan were prejudiced against the Russians. They are different, and what that Russian woman did can only confirm my point. Russia has many kind and warm-hearted people like Klavdia.
One book wasn't enough to describe the life story of Klavdia and Yasuburo in every detail. Japanese readers clamored for more. Yasuka Murao wrote yet another book, and a year later started working on a children's version. The sadness of the Japanese-Russian couple transpired in every drawing.
This is the labor camp where Yasuburo spent many years. In this one, the Russian woman takes pity on the Japanese man who doesn't know a word of Russian. She reads books to him and gives him tea.
The Japanese have respect for both Klavdia and Yasuburo, who refused to lose his self-control for many years, held on to the memories of his homeland, and eventually went back home. Yasuburo didn't forget his native language, which he hadn't spoken for more than 50 years.
For me, it certainly would have been hard not to speak my native language for more than 50 years and then start speaking it like Yasuburo once again. There's no doubt he's a very strong person.
A year after Yasuburo's homecoming, the Tottori authorities, jointly with Japanese journalists, decided to invite Klavdia to Japan as their guest. Even though she's in her 80s, she accepted the invitation. Yasuboro's two wives meet like old friends.
My heart split in two. One half's Hisako, the other half's Claudia. That's how I feel.
On her return to the village, Claudia decorated her house Japanese style. Paper cranes and vases, pictures on Eastern themes, and Yasuboro's photographs on every wall.
Once we went to the forest. He went in one direction, I in the other. All of a sudden he came to me and said, "We're leaving." A military unit was stationed close by. We were afraid lest any shadow should fall upon us.
With all of the housework done, Claudia steps into her kitchen garden for something else to do. Loneliness is when you have no one to talk to. And the household duties, at least they can keep one's mind off sad things. While weeding, Claudia remembers it's high time she sent some beet seeds to Yasuboro. Her husband was quite fond of beet, and it isn't grown in Japan. So she has to send the seeds in her letters, and take care they aren't spotted by the postal clerks.
If the postal people see them, the letter will be sent back. Later, I put in just one seed, and then 2 or 3.
She lived with her husband for more than 40 years, but one fine day she let him go. Many of the villagers just couldn't understand why she did this. As for her, she can't understand why her neighbors don't visit her as often as they did before Yasuboro's departure. But her old friends, Alexei and Lubov Rodya, make a point of calling on her once a week.
His roots are in Japan. He was born there, and his family are there. It was very hard for him to decide to leave. He did leave, but it turns out he's left half of his soul here, in the village of Progress, in this flat.
Claudia's neighbors weren't so forthcoming. Many were against her. She's to blame for being left alone in her old age.
My married daughter says she wouldn't have let her husband go. Never in her life. But Claudia knew she could expect nothing but loneliness. And she chose self-sacrifice in order to let her husband, Yasuboro, feel better down there, in Japan, with his relatives, grandchildren, and his daughter.
For more than 50 years, the Hachiya family lived without Yasuboro. So he went out of his way to make up for lost time. He took care of his wife and looked into how he could do without his daughter's help. He went shopping and cooked, and he often remembered Russia. As soon as it got cooler outside, he would take a warm coat and a fur hat, Claudia's presents, from the cupboard.
When I was preparing to leave, we went to the market together. She said, "Let's buy a good hat as a keepsake." I said, "I don't need something that expensive. Beaver Rat's good enough." "Oh no," she said, "Beaver Rat's rubbish." And she bought this hat for me.
One Saturday, there was no telephone call from Yasuboro. Claudia anxiously made a call to Japan and was told the sad news. Yasuboro's first wife, Hisako, had died at the age of 92. Every day, Yasuboro says prayers in commemoration of his late wife. He is going to take her ashes with him when he goes to Russia. He can join Claudia only a year after Hisako's death, when, in line with Japanese tradition, the mourning period has come to an end.
In Russia, even strangers come over. We talk and we eat. These are the kind of people we have up there. Here, everything's much, much more difficult.
The house, the kitchen garden, the simple housekeeping. Each day of Claudia's life reflects the others. A recent letter from Yasaburo said he was likely to return soon. This is why, whenever Claudia turns up at the railway station, she makes a point of looking at the schedule for trains arriving from Khabarovsk. It's so she doesn't miss anything if Yasaburo arrives unexpectedly. She heads for the platform, where she once saw off her husband as he went to his other wife.